Well, welcome. The title of this talk is Fetal HQ, the new standard for assessment of cardiac function. This is an interesting quote. It's from T.S. Eliot, and he said the following: "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." This really pertains to the four-chamber view. As we go through today's discussion, I think you'll get a sense of returning to the four-chamber view, which was the very first view we looked at it in the fetal environment, will give us a lot of information that we did not expect to see. This is just a list of publications since 2015 that deals with fetal HQ. So this is the background for the areas I'll be discussing, and all of this has been peer-reviewed. So when we examine the fetal heart, the question we can pose is, what should be examined? What should be evaluated? There are two major concepts. The first is the size and shape of the four-chamber view. The second is the size, shape, and contractility of the ventricles. So we're going to explore each of these areas and show you how this is done. And then, after I go through the measurements and what we've done, I'm then going to share with you three different clinical areas that we've used this tool, Fetal HQ, to examine the heart and show you what we've done clinically, which I think is very relevant to our discussion. So first, let's look at the shape and size of the four-chamber view. How is this done? This is a paper published in 2017, and what we did, we measured the shape by measuring it in diastole, the length of the four-chamber view and the widest width of the four-chamber view. So when you divide the length by the width, you compute what's called a global sphericity index. Now, the global sphericity index is simply a measurement of how round the four-chamber view is. And I'll show you in a moment, we've seen that has direct applications. So a value of less than 1.08 is considered to be the four-chamber view to be more globular in shape. Now, if we look at the area or the size of the four-chamber view, we've published two papers. The first one was using the point-to-point trace, which is on the four-chamber view on your machine, you go point, 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 and you measure the area around the four-chamber view. You can also use an ellipse tool on the machine. But basically, cardiomegaly, which is what we're trying to define, has been associated with a number of different problems. For example, if we look at congenital heart disease, cardiomegaly is associated with this list of malformations. Arrhythmias, congenital heart block, is associated with cardiomegaly. Peripheral vascular disease, ductus venosus, fistulas, etc., is associated with cardiomegaly, as well as other fetal conditions. So cardiomegaly as a screening tool is very important because it is associated with a number of different fetal conditions. And we can do that on the machine. It's hard for you to see because these are very small dots. This is a trace on the ultrasound machine. Or you can do it with an offline package, a DICOM measurement tool, which we also have used to make the same measurements. Oops, go back here. Now, Now, the other thing that's important is we look at the size of the four-chamber view, we know that things change over time. The size of the heart changes as the fetus grows in age or in size or weight. And so what one has to do is convert the actual measurement that you make at a given point in time. Say at 24 weeks, you measure the area. You have to ask, how do I correct that so I can have a standard value that I can compare statistically, or looking at what it means. This is done by computing the z-score. And what you have to do, and this just illustrates it, these are equations generated from a control group of 200 fetuses for the various independent variables, head circumference, biparallel diameter, etc. And this is the standard deviation equations. Once you've assessed this, then, for example, let's say that you're using gestational age. You'd say, what is the measured value from the fetus that you're examining? You'd put that in to the equation. Then you'd say, what is the mean for this gestational age or this estimated fetal weight? You use one of these equations to do that. And then what is the standard deviation, again, derived from equations. Once this is done, you compute a z-score. A z-score then is independent of how old or how big the fetus is. You use this in your statistical analysis. And a z-score has an equivalence to a centile. For example, a z-score of minus 1.65 equals the 5th percentile, or a z-score of 1.65 equals the 95th percentile, and so on and so forth. Now, this just illustrates, for example, if we use the trace method, the ellipse method for the area, this is a curve superimposed one on top of the other. There was no difference whatsoever in our analysis. We also provided in the paper a calculator for doing so. Now, this is a paper recently published from the Barcelona group in which they measured, I think, close to 600 fetuses. They did it by hand. And if you look here, for example, at the four-chamber view width and the length and the area, these curves are almost superimposed upon our data set, telling me that they did a great job because their data looks like my data or vice versa. But this is important because it shows you that independent groups can have the same measurement, same findings, the same distribution. Okay, that's a simple tool. Measure the length, the width, the area of the four-chamber view. Now this is the exciting part. We're going to talk about size, shape, and contractility. I attended a meeting in Barcelona on Tuesday. It was a one-day course on fetal cardiac function, and I spoke at that meeting. And also I listened to a number of cardiologists. And the thing that was interesting was the following. The cardiologists stated in a number of different ways that as the heart changes in the fetus, you go through changes in the shape first, the size, and then the contractility. So there's a sequence of events for deterioration. So what we're going to share with you now is how we can do this simultaneously in less than 4 minutes. So let's begin. So the question would be, what would be the characteristics of the ideal measurement tool to evaluate the right and left ventricles of the fetal heart? What tool could we use? Well, let's look at this. The first would be, I'd like to measure the size of the ventricles. I'd like to measure the shape of the ventricles and the contractility of the ventricles. So I'd like to have those three components. Secondly, I'd like to make these measurements simultaneously, all at once, not have to take and do multiple measurements. Thirdly, I like it to be angle independent of the position of the four-chamber view. Many of you may know that all the Doppler studies of looking at cardiac function, or the TAPS or the MAPS, unless you have an MO that you can steer, all of them require the four-chamber view to have the apex at 12 o'clock or 6 o'clock. The trouble is, in the third trimester, that position we saw only 25% of the time. I don't have time to spend an hour bouncing that fetus around in utero, having the mother walk, come back. I don't have the time. So I found that tool not as helpful because I couldn't get the position apex up all the time. So that's why it has to be angle independent. And third, provide the results of actual measurements, z-scores and centiles using different independent variables of fetal biometry and gestational age. Now, why is that important? That's important because if you have a fetus with a certain condition, you may not want to choose gestational age as your independent variable. You may want to choose the weight or the head circumference. And finally, and you want to be able to have quantitative measurements. And finally, it should take less than 4 minutes. So what is this? The tool is called speckle tracking. This is just an example. Hopefully you can see these on the screen. We have a tracing of the endocardial movement. On the left, you see the green line showing how the ventricles are moving. Here, this shows the movement of the individual parts of the muscle and how they move depending on where you're on the ventricle. This is what's called a vector analysis. Okay, now what is speckle tracking? What does it do? If you look, for example, I've isolated here a simple square on the endocardium. That square, when you blow it up, has individual pixels. We don't see the pixels with our naked eye, but the pixels have different components. They have brightness, they have a number of things that the system can identify this part of the ventricle by its thumbprint of pixels and what's enclosed in that particular square. And then it can track the movement of that thumbprint as the heart moves. You can see here, this is now tracking those pixels that are moving during systole. So it's tracking pixels. Secondly, once we have this tool to do so, if you look underneath the blanket, so to speak, what is the tool doing? Well, it's dividing the chamber. It has 49 points. The apical point is the mid, and on each side you have equidistant points, 1 to 24 on the lateral wall and 1 to 24 on the septal wall. And from these points, you can make a number of measurements, both in systole and diastole. So this is kind of what's under the scene. So the way that it's done is very simple. You take and place a dot here on the lateral wall, or actually on the system is the septal wall, lateral wall, and apex. And the system then automatically tracks that endocardial border. You do that in both systole and diastole, and sometimes you have to make a small adjustment. Once you've done that for both ventricles, which takes about 1.5 minutes to do, you push a button and then all your information is presented. Now, this is output in our study with using the TomTech software, which is the engine that is on the Fetal HQ, and I use this for my studies prior to having the Fetal HQ developed. So this is what the screen looks like in your initial output. You have a clip showing the movement of the wall. This graphic right here represents, there's the clip. This graphic represents the movement of the segments from their position in diastole to systole. This graph represents an initial output of some measurements, and this one here is just a graph showing the changes in the area and the strain. So these are the on-screen measurements that come initially with the system. However, when we saw this, we asked the question, what else can we measure besides what the system gives us? Because these measurements I just showed you are really derived for the adult population, because the software is from an adult cardiac protocol. So going back and talking with the engineers, I showed you that graph a few moments ago of those 49 dots. I said, I want more information. So here's what we did. This is first what the data looks like coming out of the system that I first had. And I think you can appreciate there's a lot of little coordinates here, probably several thousand. So when you look at that, you get a headache, right? And you're going to go, what's that? Well, what we did, working with the engineering people, we then took that sheet that I just showed you and we brought it into an Excel spreadsheet, which we created. And from that, we're going to share with you the measurements that we made, okay? So here's what we have. Now we're going to talk about the measurements, new concepts. These, as I go through this, you'll see some things that have never been reported before that I think are very useful. So let's do this. First of all, the 24-segment diastolic and systolic measurements. So what we do, this is the four-chamber view. This is the graphical overlay of that four-chamber view. You see we divide the heart into 24 segments equal distant from the base to the apex. We can obtain the length as well of the chamber, and we can also compute the area. So this is what's done automatically. From that, we can derive a number of things. This is a paper we published. We wanted to compare this with what was been done before. We measured the area of the ventricles, the basal width, the mid-width, and the length of the chamber. This has been done in other studies by using hand measurements. And we found as we looked at our data, for example, and I just recently compared this with the Barcelona group, if we look at the length of the right and left ventricles, their graphs and our graphs are pretty much almost superimposed upon each other. So this is now, again, the length of the chamber. If we look, however, at the diameter of the base, we see the left ventricle is almost, except this part right here after about 3,200 grams, is similar, but the right ventricle is wider. Now, why is that? Because they measured theirs with the apex up, and you have some echo dropout, so your borders are not as clear as if you measure the heart when the septum is perpendicular, so you have a better definition of the endocardial borders. And the same thing for the right ventricle diameter in the midsection. Again, it had a wider 95th percentile, but the left ventricle was almost the same. Okay, now, the second thing we did was for the 24 segments, which represent the first 8, the base, the mid, and the apical sections of the heart, so the base would be divided by thirds, and a third of the ventricle would be the base, the mid, and the apex. This is the right to left relationships of these measurements. And so we did that because that would be important when we have cases of disproportion. And finally, we measured the shape of the ventricles by doing the 24-segment sphericity index. You divide the length by the width. And so this is the shape of each of these segments going from the base to the apex of the heart, called the 24-segment sphericity index. Now, this is the paper we published in 2018. Right and left ventricular 24-segment sphericity index is abnormal and small for gestational age fetuses. What did we find that was important? All the previous papers that looked at sphericity index, and sphericity index, when the chamber is globular, has neonatal implications, has fetal implications, so it's an important measurement. But the other papers only measured the width at the base of the heart. If we had done so, we would have identified for the right ventricle, 23% of the fetuses would have had an abnormal sphericity index of the right ventricle. If we included all 24 segments, that increased to 40%. And you can see that different parts of the ventricle became more globular, not simply the base. The base was not concordant with the other parts of the ventricle necessarily. Same thing for the left ventricle. 33% if we measured the base, 53% if we measured all areas of the chamber. So the 24-segment sphericity index is an important tool. Finally, we look at now contractility. There are 3 different types of contractility we measure. The first is global contractility. We measure the fractional area change. We have transverse contractility. We measure diastolic and systolic widths at the point where they are in the cycle, and then we compute a fractional shortening. And we have longitudinal contractility, that is how far is the base shortening towards the apex, and in this group is the strain, which you've perhaps heard about. So these are the 5 different types of measurements that we've made. Let's look very quickly. Fractional area change measures the end diastolic area minus the end systolic area divided by the end diastolic area gives you a value of fractional area change. 24-segment fractional shortening, same concept. Now this is also an important concept that we learned from this experience. If we look, for example, at the right ventricle, the mean fractional area change from the base to the apex is pretty much constant, if you look at this blue line. Now, why is that? Because if you look at this graphic, there's very little septal movement of the right ventricular septum, but almost all the movement is involving the lateral wall. So the lateral wall of the right ventricle is what is really moving most of the time towards the center of the chamber with little movement of the septum. If we look at the left ventricle, however, you'll notice that at segment 7 through 24, now this mean value is higher for the left ventricle. Why is that? Because the left ventricle has a contribution of both the lateral wall and the septal wall. Therefore, the fractional shortening is higher. So the ventricles are acting differently when we look at this. And finally, this is just an example of a fetus that had a hypoplastic left ventricle. We see the fractional area change for the left ventricle is very depressed. And if you look at the movement of the septal wall, you can actually see changes in how the septum moves on the graphic. Here's a case of critical aortic stenosis. The same thing occurs, markedly depressed fractional shortening. Again, if you look at the septal wall during systole, instead of moving towards the center of the chamber like the lateral wall of the left ventricle does, the septum moved away towards the right side because of the pathology. So again, we have a graphic and we have information. Okay, longitudinal contractility. In the past, people have measured what's called the taps and the maps, and that's done with M-mode. So you place the M-mode cursor perpendicular to the annulus, you look at the movement on the M-mode and you measure the distance, and that has been shown that if the distance, for example, can be the increased or decreased, decreased meaning cardiac dysfunction, this is how it's been done. So it's a pretty simple tool. What we did, we used a speckle tracking analysis, and we simply tracked, using the apex as a reference point, what was segment 1, the length from the apex to the segment 1 in diastole, what was it in systole, and from that we derived our equivalent of the taps or the maps for both the right and left ventricles. Now what's interesting, and it's called APS, if you say taps or maps, that means tricuspid annular plane systolic excursion, or mitral annular plane systolic excursion. That's the big long term for it. And we found that, for example, if we look at the left and the right ventricles, the lateral wall, of course, has more excursion than the septal wall for both ventricles. If we then compare the ventricles, we note that the lateral wall of the right ventricle has more of an excursion during systole. It moves more towards the apex than the left ventricle does, but the septal wall for both ventricles is about the same. Finally, we also computed what's called the longitudinal annular displacement fractional shortening. We took a point in the mid of the chamber and made these measurements from speckle tracking and created a value that tells you how much it moved in the center. It's kind of a derived measurement. And we also took and measured strain. Now, you've heard about strain perhaps. What is strain really? Strain is the following. What you simply do is measure the length of the endocardium in diastole, the blue line. And then you measure the length of the endocardium in systole. And the cardiologists, because of how they interpret a term called deformation, they took the end systolic length minus the end diastolic length divided by the end diastolic length, and it gave you a negative value. So a minus 23 is a better contracting heart than a minus 14. Now, if you just took the absolute values, you would say 1423. There's the same concept, but they have negative values just because how they defined it, okay? But bottom line is strain represents how much the entire endocardium contracts in systole. And so you measure that, and that's called longitudinal strain. And what we noticed was in our longitudinal strain measurements, these are other studies, our our value, our mean value was, let me back it up. Our distribution, comparing to other studies, their mean values were similar to ours. They fit within our distribution curve. So these are a number of other different studies using different systems. That's for the left ventricle and the same for the right ventricle. So our values were very similar to previously reported strain values from other investigators who used speckle tracking to look at just strain by itself. Okay, and finally, before I get into the pathology cases, we can also measure left ventricular function. And the concept here is you divide the chamber again into 24 equal segments, and from this you can derive, the adult cardiologists have done this for years, can compute the volume of each of these segments, sum them, then you end up with an end diastolic volume and an end systolic volume. And from that you can compute the stroke volume per kilogram, the cardiac output per kilogram, and the ejection fraction. And so this is only for the left ventricle because the left ventricle is shaped like a bullet, whereas the right ventricle is shaped more of a triangular type of shape, and you cannot use what's called the Simpson's rule in the right ventricle. Now, you perhaps, those of you who have done this, looking at cardiac output, have used pulse Doppler. And those of you who have done that, or those of you who have heard about it, the way that is done is simply you measure the diameter of the aortic and the pulmonary outflow tract, and you measure the velocity time integral from the Doppler waveform, and using this equation, you compute the cardiac output from both ventricles. Okay, and this is these are diagrams from previously published studies. What's the problem with this? It's very simple. I want you to see if you've had too much coffee and you're doing a measurement of the aortic diameter. Here it is right here. This is the appropriate measurement. This is the corresponding computed flow, okay? And look where it falls. It falls right here in the normal distribution. However, you have too much coffee and you just wiggle it. You go from 4.6 millimeters to 6 millimeters, just a little bit off like that. Look what it does to the flow. Now it's very abnormal. So the problem with a Doppler approach is you have to be very, very precise on where you place your measurement for the diameter. Because in the equation, it really grossly affects it. That's why we don't prefer that. Okay, now let's get into the fun part. What we did after we developed, let me give you a historical background. What I did historically when I first started this process, I contacted the company that makes the software for adult cardiology. Their names are TomTech. They're out of Munich, Germany. I asked them, I said, I've heard about your software. Can I use it in the fetus? They said, I don't know, maybe. I said, okay. So they gave me a trial version for 20 or 30 days. I used it. I said, oh, it looks like it maybe tracks the endocardium during systole. And, it looks great. So then I bought the software. So I want you to understand that what I'm going to share with you, all the things I've done, I've never gotten any money from anybody. I've always had to pay, okay? Bought the software, and Fetal HQ, on my 5 machines, I purchased that as well, so I don't have nobody's paid me to do any of the stuff I'm going to share with you. So I'm completely independent of any bribery, okay, if you want to put it that way. So I did that on purpose. Some people said, well, gee, why aren't you taking charge of companies for what you develop? I said, because the minute a physician takes $1, other than getting paid, maybe give a talk someplace, takes $1 for doing anything like that, then all of a sudden you're compromised because you're doing something because you have a vested interest in it. I don't have that. So I just want to make that clear because I think that's really important. Okay, let's look at 3 different types of clinical problems. I think this will be really instructive. We looked at 50 fetuses that had an estimated fetal weight below the 10th percentile. Now, these are 2 papers. This comes from John Hobbins' group in Colorado, and we divided the papers we wrote into John was the first author on this part of it, and I was the first author on this second one. So the first paper, size and shape of the 4-chamber view of the fetal heart in fetuses with an estimated fetal weight less than the 10th percentile. Then mine was assessment of ventricular contractility in fetuses with an estimated fetal weight less than the 10th percentile. It's impressive. I just finished seeing the last PDF. It's probably going to be out there in the hard copy within a couple months, okay? But it's online as well. So what did we do? John's interest was, from the measurements that we made, Can I do a simple screening test? And, oh, by the way, before I get to that, what we did in our classification scheme, we used what's called the Delphi procedure. Let me just review that quickly, as that's important for our understanding. Their definition of growth restriction is two types. One is an estimated fetal weight below the 3rd percentile, irrespective of the Doppler findings. Second, if you have an estimated fetal weight above the 3rd percentile, but below the 10th percentile, and the Doppler of the umbilical artery and the cerebral placental ratio are computed, if it's normal, they're classified as small for gestational age. And people have thought that's low risk. And if the Dopplers were abnormal, either one or both, that's defined as growth restriction. So you see how that separates out, starting with the weight of the fetus, okay? So that's the classification scheme we used. So we had 25 fetuses that had a normal umbilical artery and CPR. By definition, that would be small for gestational age. We had 25 fetuses that were growth restricted by definition. And so it's believed that these have a higher risk for adverse outcome, and these may not. So our interest was, okay, we've done the classification. What did we find if we looked at the heart of these fetuses? Well, let's look at first the entire group. 50 fetuses with an estimated weight below the 10th. In this analysis, we didn't look at the Dopplers. We said we looked at everybody based upon their weight. And we found that 86% had an increased width of the four-chamber view, increased area, or decreased global sphericity index. They had one or all of these components. So for screening purposes, simply doing these two diameter measurements and computing the area, the width, and the length, and the global sphericity index, 86% of the fetuses, that's one of these things were abnormal. Then if we looked at contractility, and I'll show you in a minute, 86% had abnormal ventricular contractility. That's in the entire group, okay? Next, we looked at 25 fetuses that had abnormal umbilical artery and or CPR. 92% had an abnormality of the four-chamber view in size or shape, and 97% had abnormal ventricular contractility. And more importantly, this is, I think, the take-home message. If we look at the fetuses that were small for gestational age, by definition, 80% had one or more abnormalities of size, shape of the four-chamber view, and 85% had abnormal ventricular contractility. So what's the take-home message just on this first concept? You'd expect the fetus with growth restriction to have something wrong with the heart many times. But the SGA fetus, the one that you've defined as having a normal Doppler, they had a higher incidence of adverse or abnormal measurements. Now we know that fetuses who have a globular-shaped heart and globular-shaped ventricles, that they have neonatal consequences. It's been reported by a number of different groups. So this is an important screening tool. So if you have an SGA fetus, by definition, if you don't have the fancy fetal HQ system, make two linear measurements, length and width, and compute the area and the width and the sphericity index. And in the paper, we have all the paper's been published that has calculators you can download. You can compute that and very quickly ask, do I have a big heart? Do I have a wide heart? Do I have a globular-shaped four-chamber view? Okay, now if we look at the functional aspects, global contractility, I've highlighted SGA. This is the two growth-restricted categories. You'll see that they're very much the same as far as the incidence of abnormal fractional area change. If we look at the transverse contractility, you see the right ventricle more frequently has decreased transverse contractility in all three groups than the left ventricle does. If you look at longitudinal contractility, they're very similar, again, almost equally distributed among the groups. So the contractility is a part of the package of abnormal findings, irrespective of whether you're SGA or whether you have fetal growth restriction by definition. So the important message is, when you look at the definitions, fetal cardiovascular dysfunction is present in small for gestational age fetuses as well as growth restricted. So the take-home message in this study is, when you have an SGA fetus, go look at the heart, okay? Now, and this is also important, this is a study where the authors used other measurement tools for looking at cardiac function, found none of them were abnormal in the SGA group, but when they looked at atrial natriuretic peptide, it was an indicator of volume loading. They found that in the group that had a weight below the 10th percentile, normal umbilical artery, abnormal CPR, weight below the 10th, normal umbilical artery, normal CPR, they still had an increased incidence of this biochemical change. So this is some indirect evidence of something's going on with the heart. Okay, now the second group, this is also a very interesting group. Fetal growth restriction with absent reverse diastolic flow. This was a study done with Dr. Roberto Romero's group from the perinatology research branch. We had 53 fetuses with a weight below the 10th percentile. All of them had absent or reverse diastolic flow of the umbilical artery, very severe. In this group, 16 died, perinatal deaths, and 37 were born alive and lived. So perinatal deaths, 8 were fetal, 8 were neonatal deaths, and the 37, they lived through the perinatal period. So the question is, can I identify something that would tell me what's different between those with a perinatal death and those who were alive? We compared the groups. We found the area of the four-chamber view, the width, the length, and the GSI, the distribution was pretty much the same, with maybe a little bit higher, but not significant, in those who had a perinatal death. So these measurements were all abnormal in many of the fetuses. If we look at the right ventricular 24-segment width above the 95th percentile, again, no difference between those who died and those who were alive. If we look at the wall thickness of the ventricles, again, no real difference between the two groups for those who lived and those who died. So you're seeing that both groups had different types of changes. However, if we looked at those who had left ventricular areas below the 5th percentile, that only occurred in fetuses that were alive. So smaller left ventricles only was present in those fetuses who did not die. We look at left ventricular 24-segment widths. Another way of looking at the size of the chamber. The widths below the 5th percentile only occurred in those that died. That lived, not that died. So these are the ones that were alive. Now, those who died, what did we see? This is the take-home message for any of you who have ever faced this kind of a situation. The ones that died, if we look at the transverse widths, only occurred when it was above the 95th percentile, only occurred in those fetuses that died. Okay? If we look at the fractional shortening of the right and left ventricles, this is the mean fractional shortening. You'll notice it's below the 15th percentile. Here's the ones that are alive. And in the base of the heart, significant difference. And then towards the end, they kind of coalesced in the apical portion. But the right side had much better contractility than the left side. And the ones that died versus the ones that were alive for the right ventricle. Now here's the left ventricle. This is the take-home message. Left ventricular fractional shortening 24-segment. Look, below the 10th percentile. And from the segment 9, the mid portion of the heart, hovering around the 2nd percentile. This occurred in 81% of the fetuses that died, okay, compared to the ones that were born alive. And finally, if we look at the left ventricular ejection fraction, looking at the Z-score, what do we see? Z-score of minus 5.6. It's very, very low. So what we basically have to help you separate out, 94% of the fetuses that died had one or both of these findings, abnormal left ventricular ejection fraction or fractional shortening of the 24 segments. So if any of you are sleeping, wake up. There's the most important point. If I had a fetus that had absent or reverse diastolic flow, I'm trying to ask the question, is this kid going to die or is it going to be alive? I want to know. Look at that left ventricle. If it's enlarged, you're pretty close to having a problem. If fractional shortening and the strain and LV ejection fraction are decreased or depressed, you have a problem. You better pay attention to that. If the left ventricle is small, those kids lived. So what happens? The left ventricle fails right before the kids die. Okay? And that's the key element. The right ventricle pays a price for a long time. The left ventricle takes a dive, and when that happens, you're in trouble. So that's important. Okay, so what are the conclusions of that one? Cardiomegaly is common for both groups of fetuses. Ventricular wall thickness is common for both groups of fetuses. A smaller left ventricular area is present in those who did not have a perinatal death. A larger left ventricle is present in those who had a perinatal death. Abnormal LV contractility was present in fetus with the perinatal death, as represented by the following: decreased LV ejection fraction, decreased LV fractional area change, and decreased 24-segment fractional shortening. Okay, finally, in the next 7 minutes I've got, I'm watching my watch here. Coarctation of the aorta. This was published recently. And what we did, we had 50 cases of coarctation. I wanted to know what was the profile of fetuses with coarctation, because that's a common thing we see. We see disproportion in the third trimester, and we want to know, is it a coarc or is it not? So here's what we found very briefly. Coarctation fetuses, the 4-chamber view, the GSI was decreased in 31%, the transverse width was increased in 24%, area was increased in 22%. If we looked at the flattened chamber, that's the sphericity index, above the 95th percentile, it occurred in the left ventricle between 28 and 64%. So the left ventricle, of course, was flattened, which is pretty intuitive. The right ventricle was increased in diameter, had a more round chamber. You see the distribution of the base, the mid, and the apical portions of the ventricle. If we looked at the end-diastolic area, abnormal below the 5th percentile in 86% of the left ventricle, and it was larger than 30% of the right ventricle. If we look at contractility, we see, for example, below the 5th percentile, distribution of both ventricles, longitudinal strain, abnormal strain, decreased fractional shortening. And so finally, we came up with a profile. And basically, left heart is smaller, and the left heart is more flattened in shape. The right heart is bigger, and you have changes in contractility in both ventricles. So here's so you say, that's interesting. I kind of thought that. Let's ask the final question here. How can we predict which fetuses will have neonatal coarctation of the aorta from those who will not? This was a collaborative study with, again, 2 institutions, and we had, what was done, I was sent 108 4-chamber views to analyze. And it drove me nuts. It took me a few weeks to do that. So I did my analysis, and I then used all the z-scores for each of the fetuses, and I put them into a logistic regression equation, or a computer. Now, before I did that, I was blinded to what these fetuses had. I examined 108, not knowing who had what. So I wasn't, I didn't say, well, these are the 54 coarcs and these are the 54 false positives. I didn't know what they had. Then we broke the code, put them in for analysis, and we know that clinically 50% have a false positive rate when they're seen by a pediatric cardiologist. All 108 fetuses were suspected to have coarc by the pediatric cardiologist after they did the consultation. And they measured the aortic arch, and they measured a bunch of things. But we know in the literature the false positive rate when the cardiologist does that using other tools is about 50%. That means they're wrong half the time. So here's what we found. These are the variables that came out of the equation. We had the 4-chamber view end-diastolic measurements, ventricular end-diastolic size, ventricular end-diastolic shape, ventricular global contractility, ventricular strain, ventricular base-apical contractility, and left ventricular function. These were the variables of the many that we looked at, and what did they do when we put them into the equation? So what you basically do, you generate your equation from the computer. It says, here's the equation, and these are the variables that are important. And each of the variables has a coefficient value that you multiply that value by your z-score value for each of these measurements. Then you sum them together, you get what's called a logit value, and then through an equation, that value is computed to become a probability. So if you have a probability of over 50%, we said those fetuses have coarctation. And if the probability computation was less than 50%, they don't have coarctation. So what did we find? And this is the slide. The sensitivity for detecting coarctation was 96%. The false positive rate was 4%. That means of the 54 coarcs, 52 were identified by our algorithm to have coarc, and 2 were missed. If we look at the false positives, 96% were categorized as not having coarctation for specificity of 96%, and a false negative rate of 4%. So 2 of the non-coarcs were told to have coarcs, 52 plotted out not to have it. So this becomes a very powerful tool to take and do that. So, and finally, all of these measurements that I just shared with you are on what's called the fetal HQ. Now, Tuesday at the Voluson Club at, I don't know what time it is, 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock. I'll be there demonstrating how to use Fetal HQ. So any of you who have an interest, come by, hang out for a few minutes, and I'll go through some cases. But basically, what I've shared with you, all these measurements from all these papers have been now incorporated into the GE system using the TomTech measurement tool, and the GE folks have done a wonderful job of taking those raw data and putting them into graphical form, Z-score values, so you can actually see the interpretation. And it really takes less than 4 minutes to do. And finally, the last slide says this, and I have 1 minute left. This is perfect. Okay. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring of the four-chamber view will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Thank you.